Well, it's always nice to be with you. I always appreciate a place where I can come and know that as I share my honest self and honestly about where we are, I seem to always receive a really good hearing here, and then the opportunity to actually have a conversation is something I value as well. Well, this certainly is a difficult time. I don't think that's a surprise to any of us. And I suppose I could ask you individually to assess, how well each of you are doing. And, maybe individually we can feel like things are kind of normal. We're a little more concerned about this or that, or maybe our retirement incomes have gone down a little bit. But if we scratched a little deeper and if I asked you how your children are doing, how your grandchildren are doing, how your neighbors are doing, how co-workers are doing, how people that you may know who are working outside of this country, how things are going, it wouldn't take long before I think we would reach a kind of consensus that this is an unusually difficult time for people, for families, for communities, for states, for the country, and for the world. And so how do we make sense out of it? And then in making sense out of it, how do we find the courage and strength and vision to move forward in a way that gives us legitimate reasons for hope, rather than what I would call fantasy reasons for hope? And part of my struggle with the faith tradition, the Christian faith tradition, and my struggle with the Bible over the years is that I have come to see that in many ways, I think, the biblical writers, and there were many, many, many of them, were really simply human beings that were trying to make sense out of very difficult times. And they were trying to do that as best they could in the context in which they lived. And they were trying to do it in reference to questions of what the heck was God doing and why? What could they expect from God? And where could they find or root hope? And my struggle is that, quite frankly, I don't like many of the answers that they give. And it's not that I don't respect the answers that they give, but I don't find them very helpful. And I find it kind of disturbing that in general, many people of faith, it seems to me, we give too much credence to those older times, those older reflections, those older struggles that people had. Not allowing them to illuminate our own, but allowing them somehow a kind of sacred power to determine the parameters of our own debate and understanding. Well, let me be clear here and give some examples. Again, some of you have heard me talk about this before, but I think the main storylines that we get in the Bible have to do with hope rooted in God's violence, or explanations of what's going on in history in reference to God's violent power. And if there's anything that we need in the world today, it is a reassessment of what power is actually like. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute to talk about our country in particular needing a fundamental reassessment of power. But the main storylines, we have the liberating story of God's violence in the Exodus. We have the explanation coming back to people about why in actual history they were dominated by others, trying to explain exile, and the storyline that emerges is about a punishing God and how we did so many things wrong that an angry God was rightfully angry at us and did this to us. And that storyline usually came with the promise of a reversal in history when soon if we did X, Y, or Z right, God's power would be on our side again and we would be able to defeat our enemies. And that was understood as salvation. But within actual history, that didn't happen very often, or in fact, it didn't happen at all. And so a new storyline emerged in the midst of intense difficulty and repression. And that storyline is one that scares me a lot. It's the apocalyptic worldview. And the apocalyptic worldview essentially says there isn't much hope or reason for hope within history. We must place our hope in the end time, and in God's violence in the end time that will vindicate the faithful and will punish our enemies. Well, that apocalyptic worldview before this crisis that we're in, was the fastest growing religion in the world within all the religious traditions, or most religious traditions. The idea in Iraq, one of the outcomes of the war, in addition to 4 million people being refugeed or driven from their countries, and who knows how many, we don't know, it could be hundreds of thousands, it could be 1 million who have died, that an apocalyptic vision of Islam is the most rapidly growing stream of Islam within Iraq. I have on my office door at St. Thomas an article that said in 2007, in a survey, 1 out of 4 Christians believed that 2007 it was likely that Jesus would return to end the world. 1 out of 4. So this is before the intensity of the present crisis. So those explanations I struggle with and try to find alternatives to. Now, I want to make one reference to a passage in the New Testament from Jesus that came up in the lectionary a couple of weeks ago. And I'm not going to talk so much about the passage as I am about the implications of one of the words that was used in it. And the word had to do with time. Now, if I were to ask you, a lot of us have watches, what time is it? What would you tell me? What time is it? Anybody?
10:48.
Okay, 10:48. So that's one understanding of time. A second understanding of time I've already alluded to, and this was a really predominant one, and that was the idea of end time, right? The end of the world time. That's another definition of time. But there's another Greek word used for time, and it shows up very early on in Mark's gospel. And Mark tells us that John the Baptist has now been arrested, so it's a fearful time. And then Jesus comes on the scene, and this is one of his interactions with the people he's calling to be disciples. And he announces that the time has arrived, and the word for time is kairos. And that meaning of time is the moment of truth time has arrived. And in moment of truth time, the decisions that we make are really, really critical. And in my view, they're not really, really critical because if we get them wrong, we have an angry, punishing God who is going to send us into exile or punish us and our grandchildren. It's if we get it wrong, we miss an opportunity to move in a radically different direction that is actually called for in the midst of the times that we're living. And so I would like to suggest to you this morning that we are living in an accelerated kairos time, or in a particularly poignant moment in which the decisions we make are going to be so, so critical.